Welcome to the seventh and final part of my Hibernate Reactive and Eclipse Vert.x YouTube series. And up to this point we did a great job. We did a lot of stuff. We implemented a data layer, we implemented a service layer, we implemented even a web layer of our application, which is strictly speaking outside of Hibernate Reactive scope, but nevertheless we did it as well. And now, as you see, our application is just, it is great, but it's just a collection of different components of different levels, and we use integration, unit, and API tests to access them one by one, which is not very exciting. And what I'd like to do in this particular episode is to assemble everything and to be able to run our application, to interact with a real database, and finally to interact with our application web layer using HTTP client. So in this episode, what we will do, we will assemble everything together and we will see how we could actually use an application vertical pattern in order to run a Vertx application. So this is what we are going to cover in this episode. So let's start. Okay, let's start with actually assembling our application. All parts of our application would be assembled together and will be run as a single entry point. So how we could do it? Basically, we do it using a main method in our Java application, and we saw it in the previous episode. An alternative version is to use an application vertical pattern, which is technically the same idea. We also use under the hood a main method because it's the only way to run Java applications, but we will do it in a more extensible and more accessible and more customizable way, so in more like developer-friendly way of doing things, but under the hood will be the same. But the first step will be demonstrated how we could do it using just a manual main method implementation. So without further ado, let's go to the web vertical file that we already created. And now in the bottom of this file, what I'd like to do, I would like to create a main method. So basically public static void main method, which is a standard to run any Java application. And now, because our application has a dependency graph, you see that here we have this project service dependency. But if we go to the simple project service implementation, you could see that it also has this repository dependency. So if we go to the project repository implementation, you could see that we depend on this Hibernate session factory from Hibernate. And in order to build this session factory, we also need to provide a Hibernate configuration. So let's close it. And let's start by implementing the dependency graph of our application. So the first thing is to provide a Hibernate configuration. The second one is to provide a session factory. The third one would be to provide a project repository dependency. Then we need to have a project service, and finally we will have this web vertical. So, as you're familiar with this, without further ado, let's just go to the project repository implementation test, and let me just copy this stuff because you're already familiar with this and you know what's coming. So I don't need to repeat it twice, but instead of this configuration, which we used because we had this test container stuff, we will provide it manually. So we have here a port for the Postgres, and we provide a name for the database, which could be Hibernate DB. And now we have this Hibernate URL. We have a username. Let's say we have just a user, and a password would be a user secret. Of course, these are not credentials you want to use on your production system, but anyway, well, we need also to set annotated classes, and this is basically all what we need to do here. Then we need to create the session factory. Again, we just copy this code and go back and put it here. And now we have also this session factory. Now we could create a project repository. So we say project repository. and we call it project repository, and we create a new project repository implementation. Actually, because we need to use implementation, we don't have other implementation. So here we provide a session factory. Now we have here's this repository, sorry, and now we have a project service. But again, as you remember, we use this project service. So in the episode where we talk about object level permissions, and basically we don't have them, and instead we need to use this simple project service. So let's go again and let's select a simple project service, but it's again a project service. And let's create a new simple project service implementation, and we provide a repository as a dependency. Now we just need to create an instance of the web verticle. And now we have this web verticle, and we just provide a project service. So now we built all dependencies. Of course, you also could use a dependency injection framework such as Juice or Dagger or even Spring container. It's up to you. I just build the things manually because our project is pretty simple. And now, as you remember that instantiating a verticle is not all, we also need to provide deployment options, because as you remember, our application has this configuration. We need to provide a port value. So what we do, we say here JSON object config, and inside the configuration we put this port value, and we provide a port, let's say 8888, and then we say options set config. Now we have also deployment options. And finally, what we need to do here, we need to provide a Vertx instance itself. So say Vertx, and we create a new and we use this Vertx static method, of course. And now we have this Vertx instance, and we could use it in order to deploy our application. So we say Vertx deploy vertical. We provide a vertical instance and options. And as you remember, this is a future, so we could provide on success and on failure handler. So on failure, what we will do, we will actually we will just provide here a logging message, and we put here error get message. Otherwise, on success, what I like to do, because we now have here this ID, first of all I would like to print this ID, and then I would like to say that application is up and running. And now we could use this main method. So let's see how we could do it. Okay, our main method is implemented, and now let's run our application. The only thing that is missed, as you could see here, we have here a database, so we need to create this Hibernate DB first. And here in this episode, unlike the first one, I would like to use a Docker in order to run the Postgres server locally. If you have a normal local installation like we did in the first part of this tutorial, you are free to use it, of course, but here I would like to use a Docker. And by the way, I am going to my terminal, and by the way, if you're not familiar with Docker, I have a free YouTube series about Docker from the perspective of Java developers, where I highlight the most essential and common tasks that you need to know as a Java developer in Docker. So let me just check that I have an image of Postgres, so I will not download it and extend the tutorial time. So I have it, this one. And now I use a docker run command in order to run it. But first thing first, we need to provide several environment variables. The first one would be a Postgres user. And let me just go back to my IDE and check what we have here. So we have a username of user, we have a password of user secret, and finally we have Hibernate DB as a database name. So go back to the terminal. We provide a Postgres password, which is user secret, of course, and finally a Postgres DB. And in our case it calls Hibernate DB. And also don't forget that we need to do a port mapping, because we need to associate this server externally. So in order to connect to it using our Java application with a specific port. So we need to map this external port to the internal port that is exposed inside the container. And finally, we use this Postgres image. We provide a version, of course, to avoid downloading. And now we could run this server. So you see that everything is up and running, and let me go back to my IDE and let me run the main method. So you could see that now we have an error. So instead of UID value of vertical ID, we have this error. Why it is actually so? So let me stop it, and let me, instead of using this using these commands, what I like to do, I would like to say error print stack trace. So now, once we will run this this application, you will see error message, and you see that here on the line 96 we have some error with the string to the number conversion. Well, interesting what it is. And of course here we have a port, and let me check my configuration, and of course here I have a typo. As you see, I need to provide an integer value instead of string, because here we use this getInteger method. So now we fixed everything, and let's run this application again. So now you see we have a message application is up and running, and we have this ID. Now our application should be working. And how we could verify? We could interact with this application by using our HTTP client. Well, I use Insomnia here. You could use any application you want. And let me just go back to my IDE again, and let me check which path that we have. Well, let's start with the creating of some projects. So remember, we need to pass here user ID, and we need to provide a name, and the URI would be just a project. So let's go back to Insomnia, and let's create a new HTTP request. And I call it create new project. And of course, it will not be a get, but we need to create a post one. So we say HTTP localhost. We provide a server port, and we say project. And then we need to provide a body, which will be a JSON. And as you remember, we need to provide two things here: user ID, say 1, and a name, say my new project. And let's execute this command. And as you see, we have this ID, we have user ID, and we have a name, so it should be saved. Let's create another one with my new project 2. And let me create for another user ID, say here we'll say let's say my project for another user, just to check that get commands would work as expected. So let's create another one and say find projects by user. And as you remember, again we use this localhost 888, and as we go back to our IDE, here we need to say projects user, and then we pass a user ID like we have here. So let me go back to my Insomnia and say projects user 1, and let's send this request. And now we have here two projects, so for user ID of 1 and user ID of 1, sorry, with the ID of 1 and with ID of 2. And if we use the user ID of 2, let's say we have one item, and user ID of 3, we have no projects at all, but still we have successful results. So this is how we could use a main method in order to run our application. But this could be a good solution for simple applications, but especially when we talk about deployment as a fat jar or as a Docker images, it would be much better to use what is called an application vertical pattern. And now we would refactor our application in order to use it. So let's see how we could do it. Okay, let's just quickly talk about how actually we deploy applications in a Vertx ecosystem. So this idea is closely connected with two main concepts. The first one is a fat jar, and the second is a launcher component of the Vertx core library. But let's go step by step. So in our project, let me just navigate to the pom.xml file, And here you could see that we inside the plugins section, so inside this section, we actually have two plugins that I want to pay attention on. So the first one is a Maven Shade plugin, and the second one is the exact Maven plugin. So basically what it is, let me go to the documentation. So let's open a Chrome, and here we have documentation for both of them. The first one is the exact Maven plugin, and basically this is a plugin that allows us to execute programs and Java programs in a separate processes. But here we usually use the second goal, which allows us to execute Java programs in the same virtual machine. Maven Shade plugin is more familiar for you maybe, because here we use this plugin in order to create fat jars. So fat jars is a common way to deploy Java SE applications, and usually we use this not only with Vertx but basically with any standalone Java project. And if we go just back to the pom.xml file, you could see that here we have this main class property. So this one is a main class property, and we also have this main verticle, which is not the Maven Shade plugin, but it's part of launcher. So the basic idea is that we have this main verticle, which is this component. And if we will go to the terminal, so let me just go to the terminal. And inside the root directory, I would like to execute a command called mvn package. And this is a command that is coming from mvn Shade plugin that we use to create a new fat jar. So I would like also to use this skip tests flag, because actually we have here test containers, so it will take a lot of time to test them. So as you see, build succeeded, and now if we run ls command, you see that we have this target folder. So let me open this target folder, and you could see that now we have here this Hibernate fat jar file. So let's copy this name, and if I would use a Java command in order to run it, so this is a standard Java command, comes from GTK, so it's not something Vertx specific. So let me execute it, and you see that we have this HTTP server started on port 8888. Let's close it, and let's go back to the IDE. So basically what this Maven plugins do, they run this main vertical as a main entry point of our application. So this code snippet is executed. So the idea of launcher is a bit different from just setting a main class. So let's go to the documentation for Vertx core. So here, if we will just go bit to the bottom of this left list, we see this Vertx launcher. And the Vertx launcher is used in fat jars, so what we just did, as a main class, and also it's used by Vertx command line utility, but it's a bit outside of the scope of this tutorial. So basically, if we go to the Java doc documentation for launcher, you could see that launcher is nothing than just a main class that creates a new Vertx instance, and then it uses it to deploy this main verticle that we have. So this main verticle is executed. That is basically why it is actually called as a main verticle inside our pom.xml. This is the way we do it in Vertx, but it is not only way we could do it. And while this launcher is handy component, also we could do it more and more a proper way by using what is called app verticle. So let's see what is an application verticle and how does it connect with existing web verticles that we have. Okay, so far we allocated everything inside the main method of our web vertical, which is okay, but it is also a good practice to follow the separation of concerns design principle and to provide a separate component which is responsible for creation and deployment of our application. And I prefer to call it app vertical. Well, I need to say here that it's not an official Vertx design pattern, but it is something that I use in my own work with Vertx. So you could see that we have still a main method because we don't have any other way to run a Java program. But inside this main method, we create and deploy the single app vertical component, which in its turn will initialize and deploy other components such as data verticle, web vertical, you name it. Well, this deployment will happen inside the start method of the app vertical, and usually you will need to use a dependency injection framework in order to build dependencies. However, in our project, which is very small, we will not use dependency injection framework, and we will initialize things manually. So let's see how we could actually implement app vertical for our tutorial. Okay, let's now start implementing our application vertical. So let's just review what we need to do here. We have this big main method that is now defined inside the webverticle.java class, and basically in order to implement an application vertical we just need to split it into several parts. The first thing first, we need of course to create these dependencies, and then we need as a second step to create this web vertical and to deploy it. And this is basically all what we need to do in order to implement application vertical. So let's create a new package. This is called app. So basically inside this package we will allocate components that are responsible for application initialization. So let's create here a new vertical, and we call it app vertical. So remember that this is a normal Java class because we couldn't use records with extends. And let's use abstract vertical. So this component would have two things. The first one would be a main method, and the second would be a start method. So let's just think what we do here. So inside this start method we will allocate this code. So we will actually deploy vertical, deploy a web vertical inside this start method, and the main method would be used in order to actually run our application. So create the Vertx instance and then to deploy the app vertical itself. So how we could do it? So like we did it before, so we say Vertx, and we create a Vertx instance, and then we create an application vertical instance, so say app vertical. And remember that initialization of app vertical is not its deployment. And then we say Vertx deploy vertical. And here we don't need to have options because we don't have any configurations that we want to provide explicitly. And then we pass on failure, and we say standard out println, sorry, system out println of course, and we say error get message. And the second handler we want to provide is on success. And here we say, here we'll put a curly braces, and we say here the application is up and running. So, and remember that this main method will enter a loop, so it will not be finished, so it will accept web requests, etc., etc. So basically this is the main method implementation. Now we want to create a web vertical, and this is a bit tricky process because, as you see, we need to prepare this configuration. How we could actually do it? Well, in order to simplify process, I would like to use external library. So let's go to Chrome. And the library I want to use is called Google Juice. So this library is a dependency injection framework, which is very lightweight, but it's also very customizable and very powerful. And it's one of my favorite Java libraries. And if you're not familiar with Google Juice, I highly suggest you to check it and to learn this library. So in order to add it to our application, we're going to env repository, and let me Google Juice, and let's add this dependency, so this latest one. And let's go to our pom.xml, and let's allocate it inside the dependencies section. So let's go back to the web vertical, and let's review what we actually need to configure here. Well, the idea of Google Juice is that we provide bindings between our components and dependencies. So in this way we need to plan ahead what we would like to expose and what we would like to hide. So obviously we need to create this web vertical. And the web verticle has several dependencies itself. The first one would be a project service, project repository, and we also need to have this session factory. So obviously we would like to expose this web verticle to our application verticle, and all other dependencies we would like to hide. So how we could do it? Okay, let's go to the app package again and create another class that is called app module. And again, this class would be just a Java class because we also need to extend another class. So here we extend an abstract module that comes from Google Juice. And this Google Juice class will have a configure method that basically is used in order to bind between dependencies and instances. So let's go back to the web verticle and repeat what we would like to do. Okay, so we want to expose this web verticle. So this class should be initialized inside the configure methods. Not initialized, but provided, of course. And these dependencies that we have here, we don't need them outside our module because we actually will use them internally in order to create a web vertical. So let's go and let's copy all this stuff that we have. And inside that module, I would like to provide a constructor. And I would like to put this stuff here. Now, let's create some fields. The first one would be a project service, simple project service. And let's use here this keyword. So basically we don't need to have any other components outside the constructor, and we could just keep these simple project service dependencies. So this is how we initialize these internal dependencies. Now let's create a web vertical. So how we could do it? Well, inside the configure methods, what we will do, we will create a new web vertical. So we say bind, which is a method provided by abstract module, web vertical class to instance, and here's a new web vertical, and we provide here dependency, which is this project service. So now we could use this binding externally in our app vertical. So here, what we will do, we will remove this line of code and we will create a new app module. Also, we could make this app module with a default access modifier because we actually don't need to use it outside this package. So let's go back to app vertical. And now what we will do, we'll create an injector. And we say juice, create injector, and we pass here the module. Now we could use this injector in order to get instances. So say web vertical, and we say here injector, get instance, and we provide the definition of the class, which in our case is a web vertical class. And now we have this web vertical, but also you need to remember that we need to pass a configuration. So let's go back to the main module, so the main method of the web vertical, and let's get this deployment options. Put it here. Well, a small note here, of course, is we need to extract this configuration even from this application vertical and use the config retriever. And this is, of course, a different topic, and it's outside of the scope of this course. And I highly recommend you to check my book Principles of Vertex 2nd edition, where we talk about this in details. But for now, let's keep as it is. Also because we hard-coded Hibernate configuration, which is also should be extracted, but this is really outside of the scope. So now you see that we use this Vertx deploy method in order to deploy our web vertical. Let's implement it inside application vertical. So we say Vertx, and the vertex that is used here is actually the instance that's available inside app vertical. So the app deploy vertical Vertx, and we pass here options, and then we specify this on success and failure handlers. So on failure, we will say start promise, fail, and on success we will say start promise complete. So basically this is how things gonna look like. The last thing we will like to have is go to the pom.xml, and here instead of this configuration that we have, we will just comment it out, and we will provide another definition of the main class. And in our case it would be, as you could see here, we define this main class as one which comes from IO Vertex core launcher component. So one is bundled with Vertx library, but we will use this fully qualified name of the app verticle. So what we will do here, we will say Hibernate app, and we put here app verticle. So basically this is how things go. Okay, let's now start with an implementation of a verticle. So basically it will be another component that will be responsible for assembling and running our application. So let's create another package that is called app, and here we will allocate components that are responsible for the initialization and deployment of our application, and the first one would be called app verticle. And remember, we need to extend an abstract verticle from Vertex core, so we could not use records here. Let's provide a constructor here, but we will not populate it now. Let's just first start with the start method. So what we do here, we create a new web vertical instance. Then we will create deployment options for this web vertical. And we create a JSON object with a configuration, and the configuration would be usually gotten from Vertex config retriever library. However, it is outside of the scope of this humble tutorial, and you could check more information in my book Principles of Vertex 2nd edition, in one of my courses on cloud applications development, or even in my YouTube series about Docker for Java developers. But now we will just hardcore this configuration. And remember what we need to do, we need to put here a port number. And now we will use this vertex that are coming as a part of abstract vertical in order to deploy this web vertical. Provide here in options. And also don't forget to attach this config to options. And then we use this on failure handler, and we use start promise fail, and on success. Okay, now we need to provide dependencies for our web vertical, which is basically a simple project service. So how we could do it? Well, let's provide another field for this class, and let's provide as a part of constructor using constructor-based dependency injection. And let's put it here to the web vertical. Well, in the real life scenario, of course, you will use dependency injection framework in order to avoid this boilerplate codes. For more information, I suggest you to check one of my Vertex courses of my book Principles of Vertex, where I extensively demonstrate how to use Google Juice for dependency injection tasks. But now let's just copy this code up to this point number 5. So let's copy this. And let's create a main method here. So let's copy this, and now let's create an app vertical. And let's provide this project service as dependency. And now what we will do, we will provide here another Vertex instance. Of course, we use the static methods, sorry. And we use this deploy vertical. But now we don't need to provide any deployment options because app vertical doesn't have anything. And we specify here on success and on failure. Actually, we don't need to have this out.println here. And let's provide some encouraging messages. So this is how we could prepare this app verticle. Now we have it. What we will do next, let's go to the pom.xml. And here you see we have here this Maven Shade plugin. So instead of using this default Vertx and entries, what we will do, we will specify another main class that we need. So we say main class. And we provide a fully qualified name for our app verticle. And now let's think everything, and let's go to the terminal. And what I'd like to do, I would like to execute mvn package command, and I would like to skip tests because it will save a bit of time. So now we should have inside the target folder this file that we could now execute. So let's go to the target folder. And let's execute this file. So Hibernate snapshot fed.jar. So let's run this code. And now you see that the app is up and running. Let's go to our terminal and let's verify that we have a Postgres server running. So everything is okay. So let's go to Insomnia. And let's create a new project. So let's provide a new user ID of 1, and let's say my project for this user, and let's create this instance. Now we have it. Let's create another user ID, sorry, for another user, and let's create another project. So now when we say find projects by a user, we execute user ID of 1, we have 1 entry, we have a user ID of 2, we have 2 entries, and we don't have any entries for user ID of 3. So basically our application is running. So this is the way we could separate logic inside an app vertical. And as I have said, usually you will use a dependency injection framework such as a Google Juice, but for our demonstration purposes we'll avoid it. And for more information, check one of my courses about Vertx, check my book Principles of Vertx 2nd edition, and you could also check my Docker for Java developers course, which is free and available on this YouTube channel. If this video was helpful for you, I suggest you to share it with your colleagues and also provide value to them. So don't forget to subscribe for this channel to avoid missing new updates. So see you soon.